Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to Midnight Nightmare, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. But before that, please consider giving us a like. The smell of fir trees filled my nose as I laced up my boots in the gravel parking lot. It had been too long since my last backpacking trip into the mountains. Checking my watch, I saw it was just past 10 a.m., right on schedule. I did a final check of my gear before hoisting my crammed backpack onto my shoulders. Tent, sleeping bag, jet boil, food, first aid kit, everything accounted for. This was my first time hiking in the Pacific Northwest, but I felt ready for the challenge. As I started along the trail, the morning sun filtered down through the tall pines. It was midweek, so the path was mostly deserted. Perfect. I had the woods all to myself. Growing up in the suburbs, I'd always felt a deep longing for wilderness. Now 30 years old, I relished any chance to disappear into the remote backcountry, away from cell service and people. It was just me and the trees. The trail began wide and well-groomed, then gradually narrowed. An hour in, and I was completely alone, surrounded by an ancient forest. Ferns unfurled along the path, interrupted occasionally by splashing creeks. My plan was to hike 8 miles today, up to Surprise Lake. I'd make camp there for the night before continuing on to explore the alpine lakes and ridges higher up. My buddy Mark was supposed to join, but bailed last minute for work. I decided to brave the solo trip regardless. As a web developer, my life was consumed by screens and tight deadlines. Lately, I'd been feeling more burned out than ever. I hoped a few days offline in nature would help me reset. I paused to sip some water and consult my map. The right fork would take me up to Surprise Lake. Glancing at the position of the sun, I judged it was around noon, making good time. The trail began to climb more steeply now, switchbacking up the mountainside. Tree roots traversed the path like woody tentacles. My heart pumped hard and my breath came fast. I embraced the ache in my muscles. It had been too long since I really tested my stamina and grit. Out here, stripped of distractions, I could challenge myself. At a clearing, I stopped again to appreciate the view. A hawk circled lazily on an updraft, surveying its domain. Across the valley, ridges faded into a blue silhouette. Clouds cast drifting shadows on the treetops far below. After a snack and some water, I continued on, invigorated. The path tunneled through sections of old burnt forest, with brushy undergrowth taking over. Charred snags loomed like giant spears. The land flattened out again into a high alpine meadow. Grass rippled in waves, reminding me of ocean surf. As the trees thinned, vast mountain vistas emerged on all sides. Finally, I arrived at the bright blue gem of Surprise Lake. Snow dusted the rocky crags looming above. I located a secluded campsite along the shore and shrugged off my pack gratefully. As evening shadows stretched across the water, I pumped filtration tablets into my bottle. Nothing beats natural glacier water after a long day of hiking. I stood sipping it slowly, watching the colors shift, fade, and deepen. When darkness fell, I boiled up some rice and beans on my little backpacking stove. As I ate, the moon rose, dappling the lake silver. The night was so silent, I could hear my own heartbeat. Warm in my sleeping bag, I drifted off content. Out here, rather than feeling small and insignificant, I felt part of something timeless and grand. I still had a long hike ahead, but I was ready. I awoke to golden light filtering through my tent walls. Consulting my watch, I saw it was just past 6 a.m. The birds were already chorusing outside, welcoming the day. I lingered in my sleeping bag, warm and content despite the hard ground. Eventually, I motivated myself to emerge. The morning air bit my cheeks as I fired up my camp stove to boil water. I prepared some instant oatmeal and coffee while watching the mist rise off the lake. After breakfast, I spent some time tending to camp chores. I refilled my water bottles from the lake using my filter pump, to remove any organisms. Glacier meltwater carried risks like giardia without purification. Next, I dug a small toilet hole with my trowel away from water sources, as recommended. Leaving no trace was important, even in the wilderness. Once finished, I carefully buried any evidence. With camp duties complete, I turned my attention to packing for the day's hike. I consolidated things I wouldn't need, like my tent and extra clothes, into the bottom of my pack. Items I wanted quick access to went into my outer pockets and my hip belt. For snacks, I packed granola bars, trail mix, and dried fruit to fuel me throughout the day. Double-checking my map, I made sure my route was committed to memory. I also placed my satellite communicator and power brick in an easy-to-reach spot. Once satisfied I had everything, I hoisted on the slightly lighter pack and hit the trail. I planned to hike about 6 miles into a high alpine basin dotted with lakes today. My map showed several side trails and peaks to explore along the way. The crisp morning air filled my lungs with vigor as I hiked up through meadows still coated in frost. The rising sun casts golden light on the mountain ridges all around. I felt lucky to be out here witnessing such beauty. After about an hour, the trail forked. My original plan was to go right toward the alpine basin, but a small trail marker pointed left toward an old fire lookout tower. Changing plans, I decided to check out the lookout first before looping around. The narrow trail switched back steeply uphill toward the rocky outcrop where the lookout was perched. Though I still had plenty of energy, I made sure to pause and sip water frequently. The thin air at this altitude could rapidly dehydrate hikers. At last, I crested the ridge. The lookout tower stood on a stone base, its glass observation windows glinting. Unfortunately, those windows were all smashed, making the tower unusable. Graffiti covered the walls. Still, the 360-degree views from up here were incredible. I sat on a boulder, snacking and enjoying the panorama. Across the valley, glacier-draped peaks rippled to the horizon. Hawks circled silently over the forests far below. The majestic landscape reminded me how small yet connected I was. After a good rest, I continued toward the alpine basin. The trail descended steeply, then leveled out again into rolling meadows blanketed in wildflowers. Bees and butterflies bobbed through the colorful blooms. Reaching the edge of the first sapphire lake, I stopped to filter some water. The wind rippled the surface as I filled my bottles. I added purification tablets and then dropped them in an electrolyte tab for some flavor. Hydration was critical up here. Crossing a short isthmus, I arrived at the second lake. An abandoned rowboat lay half-beached on the rocks. My energy was starting to flag, so I found a sunny boulder to stop on for lunch. As I fueled up on jerky, nuts, and dried apples, I studied my map again. I could either keep pushing higher up the basin or start looping back. Checking my watch, I was surprised to see it was nearly 3 p.m. already. Where had the day gone? As much as I wanted to keep exploring upward, wisdom said it was time to turn around. With daylight fading, I didn't want to get caught in unknown terrain after dark. I soaked in a last panoramic view before packing up to head back. Even though this trip was solo, I felt gratified rather than lonely out here. The mountains had been excellent, non-judgmental company. Already I looked forward to my next visit. As I hiked back, shadows gradually lengthened across the alpine meadows. The sun sank toward the jagged peaks in the west, washing the landscape in golden light. I moved swiftly but steadily, not wanting to twist an ankle this far from help. Soon, the trail descended back into thick evergreen forest. The woods were eerily silent, no birds or squirrels chattering, only the sound of pine needles crunching under my boots. About an hour into the descent, I heard it. A high-pitched giggle from somewhere behind me. I spun around, peering between the trees. No one was there. The sound raised goosebumps on my arms. Uneasy, I continued hiking, moving faster now. The trail dove through sections of old fire-scarred forest. Burnt snags stood like giant spears among the pines. Twice more, I thought I heard the eerie giggle, closer each time. I glanced around nervously, but saw nothing. Probably just a bird, I told myself, but I wasn't fully convinced. When the laugh came again from almost directly overhead, I gasped and stumbled back. Squinting up into the branches, I desperately searched for the source. There, a shifting shape in the branches. As I stared, a face came into focus, mimicking my wide-eyed expression. My heart seized in my chest. This was no bird or trick of the light. The features continued morphing, precisely mirroring my movements. Adrenaline flooded my system. I staggered back, watching the thing shift in tandem. Fight or flight kicked in. I chose flight. Breaking into a panicked sprint, I raced headlong down the darkening trail. My feet pounded erratically as I wove between the trees. Risking a glance back, I saw a winged shadow swooping after me. The mimic stayed right on my heels, no matter how fast I ran or what twists I took. It herded me like prey down the narrow path. My mind reeled, unable to accept what was happening. Lungs burning, I pushed myself harder. Still, I could hear the mimic in the branches paralleling each turn. It seemed to be playing with me, letting the terror build. I spotted a break in the trees ahead, the steep ravine. Making a split decision, I feinted left, then hurled myself right over the edge. For a moment, I was airborne. Then I crashed and rolled down the slope, needles and stones biting my skin. I lay gasping at the ravine bottom, stunned but elated. I'd lost the mimic, or so I thought. Scanning upwards, I saw a winged shape drop silently over the rim. Scrambling up, I took off running again down the ravine, my leg throbbing. Stumbling over rocks and through grasping bushes, I desperately sought somewhere, anywhere, to hide. But the mimic was still up there. I could feel its hungry eyes on me. My only choice was to keep fleeing through the deepening twilight. The ravine seemed to stretch on endlessly before me. Behind, I could hear the mimic effortlessly keeping pace, waiting for me to finally tire out. But I couldn't give up. I pushed through the pain and exhaustion, fighting to stay ahead. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed with each jagged step. Still, I ran on. My feet pounded the trail as I sprinted headlong through the trees. Low branches lashed my arms and sweat ran into my eyes, but I didn't slow down. The mimic pursued overhead, perfectly mirroring each twisting turn I took. Looking for any advantage, I abruptly spun around and doubled back the way I'd come. But the mimic instantly copied my reversal, not falling for my trick. It stayed right on my heels as I charged back up the trail. Changing directions again, I veered off toward a thicket of young pines. I crashed through the scratchy branches, hoping to lose my pursuer in the dense woods. Risking a glance up, I saw the winged shape swoop above, never losing sight of me. Starting to panic, I scrambled wildly between the trees, with no clear direction in mind. I just wanted to put distance between myself and that thing, mimicking my every move. My chest heaved, struggling to pull in enough air. Breaking back out onto the main trail, I resumed my headlong flight downward. The mimic continued flanking me from the branches above, herding me along the predetermined path. I was its prey, being toyed with, my mind reeled, unable to accept what was happening. This had to be some vivid nightmare or hallucination. But the burning in my legs and lungs felt terrifyingly real as I ran for my life. With no shelters or hiding spots in sight, all I could do was keep plunging blindly on. The trail stretched endless and empty before me. Behind, the mimic kept a perfect pace, waiting for me to finally tire out. I tried trick after trick, doubling back, changing speeds, crashing into the underbrush. But the mimic was unfazed, perfect in its duplication of my every move. It felt like trying to evade my own shadow. The creature seemed to know these woods intimately, using the terrain to keep me boxed in. It was the patient cat just biding its time, but I couldn't give up. Terror lent my legs fresh strength as I fought on. My chest heaved in ragged gasps, struggling to pull in enough air. I tripped often now, clumsy with exhaustion. Each time I scrambled up and lunged forward again, the mimic hovering just out of reach, waiting for me to weaken further. Roots and stones threatened to turn my ankles. The mimic glided effortlessly behind me while I scrambled on all fours, sobbing from fatigue and fear. My legs trembled, ready to give out. Risking a glance back, I saw triumph in the mimic's swirling eyes. It could sense the end was near. Then my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling face first in the dirt. The mimic dropped to the trail, looming over me. This close, its flesh seemed to crawl and shift. A rank odor washed over me, making my stomach heave. Paralyzed by horror, I cowered as spindly fingers dug into my shoulders. Slowly, unable to resist, I lifted my gaze to the chaotic face. The features had stopped mimicking me, instead forming an expression of dark ecstasy. It had what it wanted, me, its prey, totally at its mercy. Frozen in terror, I could only watch as the mouth opened, far wider than any human mouth should stretch. Rows of jagged teeth glistened inside. The mimic's grip tightened, holding me in place as it prepared to feed. This was it. I was going to die alone in these god-forsaken woods. Pure instinct kicked in. With a primal yell, I suddenly shoved upward with all my might, breaking the creature's grip. Caught off guard, the mimic recoiled just long enough for me to scramble free. I saw an opening between the trees and dove for it. Crashing through brush and saplings, I fought my way back off the trail, clawing forward on panic alone. Behind me came the sound of snapping branches as the mimic gave chase. My legs pumped, and my lungs burned as I sprinted blindly into the depths of the forest. The close-pressed trees made running difficult, their limbs seeming to reach out and grab me like gnarled hands. Still, I could hear the mimic close behind, smashing heedlessly through obstacles. All my twisting and dodging couldn't shake it. Propelled by terror, I somehow found the energy to run even faster. The thing stayed right on me. Its eager breaths and deep vocalizations rang out just over my shoulder. Even with its awkward pace, it was steadily gaining ground. Up ahead, I glimpsed a break in the trees and made for it desperately. Bursting into a small clearing, I realized I was at the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, a river foamed between sheer rock walls. My pulse hammered as I raced for the ravine's edge. Behind me, the mimic chased mindlessly, too fixated to realize it was being led into a trap. My lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. This was my last chance. At the precipice, I veered sharply, skidding along the crumbling rim. Unable to check its momentum, the mimic kept coming straight at me. For a split second, we locked eyes, its alien features contorting in confusion and rage. Then it was over the edge, arms flailing uselessly at empty air. I watched as the creature tumbled soundlessly into the ravine, smashing into outcrops before crumpling small and still on the rocks far below. Gasping for breath, I collapsed onto my back. My mind reeled, struggling to grasp what had just happened. The forest was deathly quiet, save for the river's faint roar from the gorge. The mimic was gone. I was alive. Shuddering, I crawled away from the rim and slumped against a boulder. My adrenaline rush left me shaken and drenched in sour sweat. I focused on steadying my breathing as my heart gradually slowed at its frantic pace. The warmth of the sun filtering through the pines and the gentle breeze soothed my frayed nerves. But I remained wary, straining to hear any sounds of pursuit. Over the pounding of blood in my ears, the woods appeared empty once more. After resting for what felt like an eternity, I finally mustered the courage to approach the ravine again. I crept carefully to peer over the edge, braced for the sight of the broken mimic below. Instead, I saw only cracked stone and weathered driftwood far down where the creature had fallen. No twisted body or smear of blood marked its passing. I blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. But the gorge remained empty. Frowning, I followed the rim, searching the sheer walls and jumbled boulders for any sign of the mimic. Had it somehow survived and climbed out? But these cliffs looked impossible to scale. Where had it gone? That thing had pursued me relentlessly only minutes before. It couldn't have just vanished into thin air after such a fall. But no matter how hard I looked, I found no trace of its presence. A superstitious chill ran through me, and I backed quickly away from the edge. Whether dead or miraculously alive, I knew I needed to get far away from this cursed place. The sun was lowering toward the peaks, and soon these woods would be shrouded in dusk. I backed away from the ravine, uneasy that there was no sign of the mimic below. As much as I wanted it to be gone, my gut said otherwise. Something that evil didn't just vanish so conveniently. Wary, I followed alongside the gorge, peering down the sheer walls for any glimpse of where it may have climbed out. But the rock face looked smooth and unbroken. No blood smears or torn foliage marked the mimic's passing. As a rustling sounded behind me, whirling around, I expected to see the creature limping from the trees toward me. Instead, just a harmless robin taking flight. I sagged with relief, but an ominous dread still filled me. These woods no longer felt welcoming and majestic. Now they seemed watchful, the lengthening shadows hiding unseen threats. I needed to get out of here fast, far away from the ravine where the mimic had disappeared. Picking up my pace, I hiked rapidly back toward the main trail. My bruised leg screamed in protest, but I pushed through the pain. Paranoid, I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for any odd sounds. But nothing pursued me through the still forest. Eventually, I located the trail and turned downhill, moving as swiftly as my injury allowed. The surrounding pines pressed close, their needled branches clawing at me like tentacles. I shivered, skin crawling with the sense of being watched. I hurried along the trail, my bruised leg throbbing with each step. Twilight was settling over the forest, and I needed to reach the trailhead parking area before full darkness fell. The trees crowded closer, their branches seeming to grasp at me with twisted fingers. A dry branch cracked loudly from somewhere up the trail, and I spun around wildly, peering into the darkness between the trunks. Still, I couldn't shake the prickling feeling of unseen eyes tracking my every move. The stubborn ache in my leg made going faster difficult, but I pushed through the pain. Being out here alone at night was not an option. The forest took on a sinister cast as darkness leached the color from the world. Shadows melted and morphed at the corners of my vision, forming nightmare shapes that were gone when I whipped my head around. My mind was playing tricks, I knew, still gripped by primal fear. I repeatedly thought I glimpsed darting movements between the trees, only to find nothing there when I forced my gaze to focus. Closing my eyes briefly, I took deep breaths, trying to steady my fraying nerves. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. All that mattered was escape. Reaching a fork in the trail, I hesitated, struggling to get my bearings. Each path looked much like the last. Unsure which way led out, I chose one at random and plunged onward. I refused to slow my pace even as the ground became rockier and less defined. The surrounding woods seemed to shift and resettle around me, erasing any landmarks I tried to memorize. I strained for any sound or smell of civilization, but found only silence. How long had I been staggering through this maze? Minutes bled into hours as I pushed ahead. My watch face was scratched and unusable, the hands frozen. Dread twisted my gut. Maybe I'd been going in circles all this time. I shook my head sharply, banishing those thoughts. I had to stay focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The parking lot couldn't be much farther. Once I reached my car, I'd be safe. I just had to keep going. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted something through the trees up ahead, moonlight glinting off metal and glass. Hope leaped in my chest. Breaking into a limping sprint, I crashed through the underbrush into the gravel parking lot. My Subaru sat waiting for me under the bright lights of the parking lot. Nearly sobbing with relief, I fumbled my keys out and yanked open the door with trembling. I all but fell inside, pulling the door shut firmly behind me and engaging the locks. Only then did I finally dare to breathe deep, my twisting gut unwinding. I had made it out. I sat parked in the empty trailhead lot, struggling to slow my breathing and stamp down the panic still flooding my system. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I focused on the feel of it under my hands, grounding myself in the present. I was safe now, I told myself. It was over. But my heart continued racing like I was still sprinting for my life through the woods. Closing my eyes, I could vividly see the mimic's face twisting in rage as it plunged over the ravine's edge. That image felt seared into my mind. Willing my trembling hands to be steady, I finally started the engine. The Subaru rumbled soothingly to life around me. Escape was close now. All I had to do was navigate these remote dirt access roads until I reached the highway. Twilight was rapidly fading to true darkness as I pulled out of the parking lot. The trees pressed in densely on either side, barely allowing a glimpse of the sky. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes fixated forward. The twisting road tunneled endlessly through the forest, with no signs or markers to gauge my progress. The shadows deepened, playing tricks on my frayed mind. Focus, I told myself. Just focus on moving ahead, 1 mile at a time. The blur of passing trees and the car's hypnotic motions lulled me briefly into a trance-like state, but the mimic's wild eyes and jagged grin lurked at the edge of my awareness, waiting to haunt me again. I shook myself sharply, scared of letting my guard down. How long had I been driving through the night-cloaked woods? My sense of time felt warped, minutes blurring into endless hours. Occasional moonlight through the branches provided my only clue that I was even still moving. Finally, miraculously, the road began to widen and straighten. Houses started appearing between the trees, then streetlights, then a gas station. I nearly wept at the sight of this rustic but undeniably civilized town. I was almost home. The empty highway opened before me. As I sped under familiar green interchanges, the vice around my chest finally loosened. But over the coming weeks, the peace I craved remained out of reach. At random moments, the memory would surface again. I'd relive each panicked breath, each pounding footstep in excruciating detail. Most nights, the mimic waited to greet me again in my dreams, perfectly mimicking my every move as I tried frantically to escape. I jolt awake drenched in cold sweat, irrationally certain it had followed me out of the woods. The nightmares never fully faded. Some primal part of me was still back there, trapped in those woods. I doubted I'd ever be fully free of the mimic's haunting presence. Those woods had left their mark on me. I'm 16, live in Alabama, and as the typical Southerner stereotype, I love hunting. It's my passion, and I can't get enough of it. Something about the woods and the thrill of the hunt just satisfies me. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened on any of my other trips, besides the one that I will describe. But before we get into my encounter, I think I should give a little background information. According to my mom, my dad would take me out with him when he went hunting on our private property when I was just a little guy. And then one day, he suddenly just stopped hunting altogether. Like, completely done with it. He took down all the stuffed deer heads and skulls, etc., and tried to sell his guns. Luckily, my mom was able to talk him into letting me have one of them, a bolt-action rifle with a thermal scope, when I was old enough to be responsible with it. I didn't know why my dad did what he did, but I think I found out during the events of my story. My first hunt alone was when I was around 13 years old. I had previously gone with my best friend and his dad, but this time I wanted to try it by myself. My dad's old camouflaged tree house was still intact deep in the woods, and I used that until I was older. Nowadays, it has pretty much fallen out of the tree due to my lack of actually trying to take care of it. So, I decided to make my own way of hunting. I had just turned 15 when I put my idea into action. I'd been playing a lot of Call of Duty lately, I still do to this day, and was obsessed with the idea of ghillie suits. For those that don't know what those are, it is basically a tactical form of camouflage used by military operators, mostly snipers, that are meant to disguise oneself completely by attaching various parts of the surrounding environment, such as leaves, grass, or whatever was around, to all areas of the body. It comes into play mostly when the user is laying down or hiding in a bush or other small foliage. If you want to see one, just Google it. Anyhow, on to our main story. I had managed to throw together a pretty good ghillie suit out of my dad's old hunting clothes and a bunch of leaves that I found outside. It was fall at the time, so dead leaves were my best bet of concealment. In the present, I've earned a nickname at school for my unique form of hunting, the Bush Boy. I was feeling so excited, imagining myself aiming my rifle at a large buck and bagging something great that day. My girlfriend, who we'll call MJ for privacy reasons, always liked seeing what I brought back from the woods, even though she wasn't too into the idea of killing animals for sport. Deciding that evening or night would be the best environment to test my ghillie suit, I left my house at around 7:30 p.m. on a Saturday, a decision I now regret. I had brought my usual gear, my dad's old rifle with the thermal scope, the Glock G40 10mm that I had saved up for myself and my dad bought for me since I wasn't of legal age to purchase it on my own. For those wondering why I have that, it's for in case I unfortunately don't get the kill in one shot with my rifle, and I have to put the poor animal out of its misery at close range, even if my prize ends up having a bullet hole through its head. I also brought my hunting knife, a shovel, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. Now, I'm a bit of a crazy guy and not afraid to get a little blood on my hands. I usually slice off only the heads of my kills and skin them, collect the skulls when I get home. One of my favorite movie franchises is Predator, whose antagonists are aliens that hunt dangerous species, including humans, and take their schools as trophies. I'm a dork and love copying them. Except I prefer to shoot deer and not Arnold Schwarzenegger. But I'm not a monster, and I try to show some respect by burying the remains of my kills, hence the shovel. As I was walking into the woods to find a good spot to lay down, I FaceTimed MJ, like I usually do before I really get into the zone. She picked up immediately, and we had an interesting conversation about my new appearance. I fondly remember her repeating the phrase, "You look ridiculous, but hot at the same time." When I finally found a suitable spot to lay down, we hung up after many "I love you," and I put my shovel and first aid kit against a nearby tree and marked the tree with a neon pink ribbon so I wouldn't lose them if I got something and went over to it to do my work. Then, I laid down on my stomach, rifle ready, and waited, and waited, and waited. By the time I looked at my watch, 3.5 hours had passed. I usually go home after about 3 hours without anything showing up, but today I was determined to catch something with my beloved new ghillie suit. About 15 minutes later, luck found me. A huge buck came wandering out of the brush around 20 yards away. It was unnaturally tall, I'd guess standing at around 5 feet, and looked quite disheveled, like it had not eaten in a long time. The weirdest part about it was its eyes. They were blank-looking and milky white. It sent a small shiver down my spine. However, I brushed off this odd phenomenon by assuming that it was blind. My eyes were only on the prize, the giant rack of antlers that sucker had on its head. But the fact that this deer may be blind made it more likely that it used its ears to get around and avoid predators, and that any movement I made, even moving my foot in the leaves, would be enough to make it run off in panic. Recognizing this, I tried to be as still as possible while adjusting my position to get my crosshairs right on the heart. The buck was standing still as a statue, making it slightly easier to aim exactly where I knew the heart would be. What was strange, however, was that my thermal scope appeared not to see it. The only way that was possible was if the deer wasn't giving off any body heat, which was physically impossible. Looking through the scope, it was like the buck was simply part of the trees and bushes around it. I could only see its outline because it was standing so still. The forest had also fallen unnervingly quiet. Utter silence, making a mental note to see if there was anything wrong with my scope. When I got home, I lined up my shot and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the deer dead in the spot I had been aiming for, and I saw a burst of scarlet come from it as the muzzle flash from my gun briefly lit up the almost pitch-black environment. I listened for the thud of the deer as it fell to the ground, screaming in pain, before I stood up and let out a cry of triumph. Even though my ghillie suit hadn't really been of any use since the buck was seemingly blind, I was still happy that I had managed to bag something this big. I turned on my flashlight and walked over to the tree where I left my other gear, where I now laid my rifle before taking out my hunting knife and twirling it around in my hand. Illuminating the spot where the deer had fallen, I noticed that it was still moving. Sighing and feeling disappointed that this trophy wouldn't be entirely intact when I finally claimed it, I pulled out my handgun and turned the safety off before walking towards the still struggling deer, intending to end its suffering with a shot to the head. However, I stopped in my tracks as the bleeding animal suddenly went quiet and it stood up, on two legs, like a person. I'm exactly 6 feet in height, and I'm one of the taller dudes at school, but this thing towered over me, standing at least 9 feet tall. And mind you, there was still about a 15 yards distance between me and the deer. Now looking closer, I observed that instead of hooves on its front legs or hands, it had human-like hands that all ended in claws, stained with what appeared to be blood. I simply stood there looking up at this thing, dumbfounded and terrified at the abomination that stood before me. I couldn't move. I was so scared. I thought I was dreaming and squeezed my eyes shut to try and make myself up. But then, the creature opened its mouth, revealing a set of huge and razor-sharp teeth, and screeched. It was the most horrible noise I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounded like a combination of a younger woman screaming at the top of her lungs and a mountain lion's roar. I was still stuck where I stood, eyes wide. Suddenly, the thing fell back to all fours and started scuttling towards me like a spider, its body and head low to the ground. It was then that I was finally able to turn tail and sprint at top speed back towards the familiar direction of my house, not caring that I was leaving my dad's precious rifle and other items behind. I'm pretty sure that if I ran that fast again, I could outrun Usain Bolt in his prime. But all the while, I could hear the monster right behind me, still screeching its horrible screech. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my calf, but it didn't slow me down one bit. Sighing and feeling disappointed that this trophy wouldn't be entirely intact when I finally claimed it, I pulled out my handgun and turned the safety off before walking towards the still struggling deer, intending to end its suffering with a shot to the head. However, I stopped in my tracks as the bleeding animal suddenly went quiet and it stood up, on two legs, like a person. I'm exactly 6 feet in height, and I'm one of the taller dudes at school, but this thing towered over me, standing at least 9 feet tall. And mind you, there was still about a 15 yards distance between me and the deer. Now looking closer, I observed that instead of hooves on its front legs or hands, it had human-like hands that all ended in claws, stained with what appeared to be blood. I simply stood there looking up at this thing, dumbfounded and terrified at the abomination that stood before me. I couldn't move. I was so scared. I thought I was dreaming and squeezed my eyes shut to try and make myself up. But then, the creature opened its mouth, revealing a set of huge and razor-sharp teeth, and screeched. It was the most horrible noise I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounded like a combination of a younger woman screaming at the top of her lungs and a mountain lion's roar. I was still stuck where I stood, eyes wide. Suddenly, the thing fell back to all fours and started scuttling towards me like a spider, its body and head low to the ground. It was then that I was finally able to turn tail and sprint at top speed back towards the familiar direction of my house, not caring that I was leaving my dad's precious rifle and other items behind. I'm pretty sure that if I ran that fast again, I could outrun Usain Bolt in his prime. But all the while, I could hear the monster right behind me, still screeching its horrible screech. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my calf, but it didn't slow me down one bit. Thankfully, I spied the lights of my house through the trees. A small sense of relief flooding me, I flew across the empty backyard, up the porch, into the house, and slammed the door so hard that the entire house shook. I rushed over to the window and ripped the curtains away, but there was nothing. The lights of the back porch illuminated an empty backyard. The deer was gone, vanished. Still not convinced that I was safe, I hastily zoomed all over the house, locking every door and window and triple-checking that they were indeed locked after I finished. Once again, I found myself at the back door. But suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "You saw it, didn't you, son?" It was my dad. He was standing stock still on the stairs in his pajamas, staring right at me, without blinking. Adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and I was still on high alert. After thinking for a moment, I gave him an answer. No, what? I just got startled by a grizzly. Yeah, a grizzly snuck up on me. I think I'm going to go to bed, though. I slowly walked up the stairs to go to my room, my dad still standing there, unmoving and silent, watching me go up the stairs until we couldn't see each other anymore. As I arrived in my room, a pleasant surprise awaited me. My girlfriend, MJ, was sitting on my bed, smiling at me. She started to ask if I had gotten anything, before a look of concern fell over her face. I saw myself in a mirror and couldn't blame her. My ghillie suit was shredded, and I was as white as a sheet. By then, the adrenaline rush had started to wear off, and I started shaking and trembling violently. MJ quickly got up and helped me lay down on my bed. I distinctly remember her saying, "Shh," and playing with my hair, as I rested my head in her lap and just laid there, gasping for air. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was seeing my alarm clock reading 1 p.m. MJ had fallen asleep, her back against the head of my bed and her fingers still touching me own head. I gently sat up, and she woke up as well. "Sean, what's wrong? What happened last night?" She took my hands and looked straight into my face when she asked. I didn't know what to say, what I was supposed to say. Eventually, I ended up whispering, "Monster." She didn't know what that meant, and so I slowly told her the same story that I'm telling you now, about what happened in those woods, about the not deer. Thinking back on this, I remembered something. My ghillie suit. It had worked. The monster clearly had not been blind, but had not seen me when I was laying on the ground. If I had not been wearing it, I probably would have died. I'm sure that you're thinking that this is where it ends, but I'm afraid that I had one more experience with the thing that chased me that night. Quite unfortunately, it happened the next evening. But this time, I wasn't in the woods or alone. I was home alone with MJ. It was around 9 p.m., and my parents were out, likely at a party. MJ had stayed at my house for the day because she was still worried about me. We had just eaten dinner and were in my room, having our snuggle time. My calf was bandaged up because it turned out that the monster had managed to land a hit on me during our high-speed chase back to my house. It was a single scratch mark, but thankfully had not gone very deep. MJ and I turned out the lights, and we went to bed, the sound of crickets and such lulling us to sleep. Around 15 minutes later, everything suddenly went quiet, like someone had pressed the mute button on the Earth's TV remote. The deathly silence that I now associate with the not deer. MJ was asleep with her head on my chest, but I was very much awake now. She must have woken up too to the sound of my heart skyrocketing above 2,000 decibels, and she blinked up sleepily at me. Then we heard a soft tap, tap, tap at my room's window that ironically happened to face the woods. We were both frozen in fear, listening for another sound. And it came again, tap, tap, tap. MJ looked up at me again and whispered that she was scared. So, I told her to stay put as I got out of the bed. I'd left my unloaded Glock within arm's reach from the bed earlier in the morning, so I grabbed it, slipped the magazine in, and flipped off the safety. I crept towards the obscured window, dreading what I would find. Almost standing right in front it, I peeked out of the crack between the curtains and saw what appeared to be an antler right outside the window. I quickly turned around and slammed my back against the window, realizing what was outside. MJ was looking at me with fear in her eyes, and all I could do was stare back at her. Then there was another tap, tap, tap at the window behind me before I heard a voice call my name from outside. It was MJ's voice. "Sean, come outside, Sean." It sounded exactly like her, but nothing like her at the same time. It was flat and emotionless. MJ was silently crying now and panic whispering that it was not her speaking. Then the voice came again. "It's me, Sean. Come give me a kiss, Sean." By now, I had regained my confidence and decided that I had to do something to protect myself and my girlfriend before the creature outside got into the house. So, I turned around, raised my gun, and emptied the entire magazine through the window. It shattered, and I heard that god-awful screech again as I glimpsed the not deer scramble back into the woods and out of sight. I had to have hit it. I was 100% sure. But I was not going to take any chances, remembering that this thing had pretty much shrugged off a rifle round the previous night. So, I tossed the gun aside, grabbed MJ's arm, and went to hide in the attic. The only thing I remember afterward is my parents getting home around 2 in the morning and finding us hiding there. My mom was quite reasonably upset that I had shot my window out, but my dad was not. He seemed to know what had happened, and went off to go order someone to replace the now destroyed window. MJ went home, and I couldn't blame her. It's been a year since this happened. MJ and I are still happily together, but we do not talk about what happened those 2 nights except when we are alone. I still go hunting with an improved ghillie suit, and I managed to recover the gear I had left in the woods during that fateful encounter. However, I always make sure that the deer I'm about to shoot is normal-sized, has normal eyes, and gives off body heat. What I believe nearly killed me those 2 nights a year ago was a Wendigo, an evil spirit doomed to walk the earth forever, fueled by rage, ever thirsty for blood, picking off those unfortunate enough to be fooled by its disguise. I haven't seen the not deer again, and I don't particularly want to, but deep down, I know that one day it will appear again. When it does, I do not think it likely that I will escape it for a 3rd time. That is why I have pledged to do whatever I can to try and end this monster, whether it be by bullet or the power of Christ, when that fateful day finally does arrive. Growing up in Ireland, there are many places worthy of exploration with rich histories and beautiful views, and as I've gotten older, friends have often come with me to explore these places. The typical group I go with involves my boyfriend, whom we'll call A, and 3 of our friends, whom we'll call J, M, and H. At 10:30 p.m., we met up in the local McDonald's car park, each of us decked out in hiking boots, combat trousers, heavy coats, hats, gloves, and torches. We had gotten out to do a final check over our gear to ensure we had spare batteries, pocket knives, rope, and a first aid kit. We took our exploration trips seriously, having encountered our fair share of antisocial groups and, on one occasion, a very angry pigeon that resulted in the small scar above my eyebrow. In our naive minds, we were more than prepared for the night ahead, leaving little room for things to go wrong. We had all crammed ourselves into my boyfriend's Land Rover and set off towards our location of the night. an 11th century monastic site hidden out in the countryside on a small island in the middle of a lake, reached only by an old rickety bridge. For those who don't know what a monastic site is, it's the location of an old monastery that has since become a ruin. I'd been before, though during the day, and found the place breathtaking, so made the decision to recommend the site to our group. They agreed. Eventually, an hour, 5 wrong turns, and a loose sheep later, we came to the bridge that led to the ruins. When I call it a bridge, it was, in reality, little more than rotting planks of wood thrown together to create a 20-meter, 65 ft, long walkway that stretched across the shallow lake to the small piece of land home to the monastery. Getting out, we had all made our way across the planks, having to balance ourselves and our gear carefully, but nonetheless we made it across in one piece, aside from Jay getting his foot stuck between 2 of the old boards. On the other side, we were met with the shrouded tree line that sheltered our destination, and turning to look back over the bridge, we could no longer see my boyfriend's four-wheeler due to the thick mist that had fallen upon the surrounding area. Despite what you might think, none of us found the area creepy or sensed anything dangerous, not even when we arrived at the actual ruins. In fact, in the pale light of the waxing gibbon moon, the place was beautiful in a mystical way that felt as though you may come across some piece of ancient magic. For the first 2 hours after our arrival, nothing out of the ordinary happened. We all spread out over the place, seeing it for ourselves, and had found some cool stuff. A had found a cool glass bottle that once had contained whiskey, though was unfortunately completely empty now, and I had found a small smoking pipe that I had proudly set into my backpack as a souvenir of our trip. Things were going smoothly until, at about 2 a.m., M began screaming hysterically from the other side of the island. This side of the island was bare of trees or ruins and was nothing more than extremely arid soil, so we had found it odd that M would be over here at all. Running over, we saw her sitting on the ground, her knees pulled tightly against her chest and pointing wildly to a pile of rocks that I had missed on my first inspection of the area. Upon further study, however, it became apparent that it was not a pile of rocks, rather a pile of small but very dead animals. The smallest of these creatures was a little mouse, and the largest a fox. There were also birds, squirrels, a number of other various rodents, and one tabby cat. These animals had very clearly experienced gruesome deaths, with eyes being gorged out, lacerations along their abdomen, and limbs torn off and added neatly to the pile. It is important to note that there are no large predators in Ireland. The biggest you will see are badgers and foxes or domesticated dogs, but nothing that would have been capable of doing this. This raised alarm bells, as it meant whatever had done this was very human. The dead animals stank, but I found it very hard to look away from them and stared on confused. I had been by this area already to check it out, and while it was only a quick look, I had been certain that there was nothing here. No pile of rocks and no bad smell. Now it's entirely possible that I had missed this anomaly and it had been here the whole time, but the flesh of the animals was still perceivably warm and fresh, and I certainly would not have been able to miss that god-awful stench. Was something here while we had been on the other side of the island and left in the time that M came upon the site? We asked M if she had seen anything else, but she was adamant that she had been wanting to take a second look in case she found anything here and instead found the animals, and that nothing else had caught her attention or seemed to her as odd. All of us were admittedly a little shaken and creeped out, and I felt a nauseous sensation pulling in my chest. We made the decision to head back to the main site of the ruins and grab a bite to eat before heading home. When 4 a.m. came, we had finished up and were preparing to leave the area. The events of 2 hours ago had been pushed to the backs of our minds, and we were laughing freely at whatever stupid tales H was recounting. Until, at least, we all at once picked up on the dead silence of the surrounding area. I'd read about this in other people's stories of when they'd gone hunting and the woods had gone silent, but I'd never experienced it for myself until now. When I say it was silent, I mean there wasn't even a breath of wind or a ripple of water against the shoreline 10 meters from us. The tree line was mute, and not even crickets seemed to make a noise. This was a silence completely alien to anyone in our group, and immediately, feelings of unease and panic set in. "Hey, I think we should speed it up a bit. Get home soon. My ma will be barking up my arse if I arrive home when the sun pokes up," said H in a lighter tone, breaking the silence and hauling his rucksack onto his back. "Aye, mate, good shout. Let's head home," replied A, though in a quieter voice than he usually uses. We had reached the other side of the tree line and to the rickety bridge to return to the car when a loud, aggressive metal banging assumed from the direction of the monastery we had just left behind. We all froze. Turning back to the tree line we stared on in fear, J, H, and I had pulled out our pocket knives, and we were all shining our torches carefully along the dark line of vegetation, searching for any movement. It was this very moment that my life changed. I saw what was upon first glance only a shadow, but bringing my torch to light it up again, it was very clearly the figure of a very tall, very lanky man. He must have been around 6.7 and stood hunched. This man had no discernible features, nor clothes, and was completely shrouded in darkness, despite the light of my torch shining on him. In his arm he carried something long and sharp, and it hung loosely at his side, grazing the ground beneath him. But what scared me the most was his flesh. It was lacerated entirely, and even charred in places, rotting away from his bones. He was missing his left arm, and his lips had seemingly rotted off to reveal a gaping hole of a mouth. He had no eyes, only torn flesh around his sockets, suggesting that they had been carved out, just like the animals. I didn't know I was screaming until a hand clamped over my mouth, and a panicked voice cried my name. "What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you screaming? There's nothing there." It was A. I stopped and turned to face him. They all had a worried look on their faces, clearly thinking I had gone mental. "There! Can't you see him? He's right there!" I had been yelling, pointing angrily at the man, who had not moved an inch. They didn't see him. All they saw was the empty tree line and their friend on the verge of a breakdown over something not there at all. So I stopped. The drive back to the McDonald's car park was silent, and no one spoke a word of goodbye to one another as we parted ways. A drove me home, and when he pulled up outside my house, he grabbed my hand. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw back there, but I swear we didn't see anything. We were all hyped up and a little bit freaked out. It could have been a trick of the torchlight. Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow," he said, kissing me gently on the head. I believed him. He was probably right after all, so I decided not to think on it anymore, until last week when I had a dream about the island. 3 nights ago, as of writing this, I made A take me back. We arrived at the other side of the bridge at 8:15 p.m., and I saw nothing. Deciding it wasn't enough, I continued on to the ruins, against A's pleading for me to leave. The second I got to the monastery, a wave of rotting flesh hit my senses, and it took all my strength not to empty my stomach there and then. I forced myself to look around, and at first I saw nothing. But as I turned back to leave, I saw, put of the corner of my eye, a tall figure standing by the collapsed stone. I didn't dare face it. I don't think I could have even if I wanted to. Ignorance is bliss, right? I regret going back to that place. A still swears up and down that he saw nor smelt anything on the first or second times we were at this place, but I know what I saw and felt. I don't take any type of drugs or medication, and I'm not prone to mental episodes. I was very much aware of my surroundings. What was there felt very real. Despite this, every part of me wants to see it as a figment of my imagination and move on, but I can't. I refuse to call it a ghost, as M jokingly called it, or a spirit, or a demon. I don't know what it was, but it felt like death itself had shown its face to me. I haven't been able to sleep the past 3 nights, and I've barely eaten. I don't know how to process what I've seen. If anyone at all could offer me some advice or insight, I would really appreciate it. I grew up on the top of this mountain that was mostly abandoned since the 60s when an old ski kill burnt down. There were 2 other full-time residents up at the top where we lived. The rest of the houses stood empty the majority of the time, or were abandoned. The history of this mountain dates far back, hundreds of years ago. Before the colonization of Canada, there were 2 native communities at war. One lived on top of this mountain, one lived in the valley below. At the base of the mountain, the 2 communities were supposed to meet for battle. During the journey down, the valley tribe snuck up behind the mountain tribe and slaughtered all their women and children. When the mountain tribe returned home, they were apparently slaughtered too. On the entire mountainside, these vining wild strawberries grow, and it's said they grow from the spilt blood of the mountain tribe. Many people have died on this mountain. When I was growing up, there were hundreds of old crosses littering the twists and turns up the mountain. My father later became one of those crosses. In a small meadow surrounded by trees sat a small cottage, no driveways, and only an overgrown pathway to lead you to it. If you looked inside, their breakfast sat still prepared, oatmeal and eggs, untouched for years. The man that lived there was supposedly a fugitive who disappeared further into the mountains when the police came up and found him one day. We had these weird neighbors who would come 2 weekends a month from the city with their daughter, who was my age. They would bring friends over, get high, drunk, and naked, and have orgies in their yard or the forest. There was this eerie feeling you had while on this mountain, which was aptly named Forbidden. I stood looking out my bedroom window at night. I swear, I could see things moving in the forest below. We had the highest concentration of mountain lions in the world, and I was often stalked home. One night, my mother woke to the sound of the sliding door opening and closing. She walked downstairs, and my sister was standing there sleepwalking, whispering over and over, "Here, kitty, kitty." My sister had never been a sleepwalker until this. My mother grabbed her, closed and locked the sliding door, then flicked on the lights, and right there on the deck, pacing back and forth, was a cougar. My father also became a violent sleepwalker while living up there. He would have screaming matches with the wall, sometimes ended up throwing items around. This wasn't something he did until the last few years of his life. My father was a skilled driver and had driven up this mountain and many narrower, steeper logging roads around the area, many times. A few months before the accident, I started having waking nightmares of my father's death. Something was telling me he was going to die. I remember waking up frequently and looking out the window into the forest during this period and feeling like something was communicating with me that he would die. He kissed me goodnight one night and went out the door to go to town with his friends. They left in separate vehicles, him first. From the accounts of what happened, it was a freak accident. They were driving below speed limit, down a straight stretch nearing a cliff corner, when my dad's truck suddenly lost traction and started skidding sideways towards the cliff. My dad opened the truck door and jumped out, and the truck suddenly veered the other way and flipped onto him on the ground. Something that physically shouldn't have been possible. It crushed almost every bone in his body. He survived for 8 days in hospital after being airlifted. The day he died, I knew again. I knew he was dead, and it was like this feeling that something was communicating this to me. I didn't need to be told. I was so sure of this feeling that I collapsed onto the ground the second I got this feeling and starting screaming, "His dead, isn't he? His dead, isn't he?" over and over again. I was 8. I had never experienced death before. There's a lot more that went on up there to a lot of different people over the years. It's known locally as a haunted and weird place. Nothing good ever happens there. People do weird and crazy out of character things, commit heinous crimes, die, or just lose their minds. We moved when I was 9. I never felt that feeling again anywhere else, that feeling of something insidious all around you. I've only been up there a handful of times since, and every time I do, that feeling returns.